It was a bright spring afternoon in Washington, D.C., and the city was buzzing with activity. News cameras flashed, journalists scrambled for headlines, and political commentators speculated on the latest developments from Capitol Hill. But the real attention was on a high-profile charity event held at the Smithsonian Institution. Among the attendees was Barron Trump, now 18 years old, tall and poised, yet largely private. Unlike his famous father, former President Donald Trump, Barron had maintained a relatively low profile throughout his teenage years. He had occasionally appeared at public events, but he had mostly stayed out of political debates and media controversies. However, that day was different. He had been invited as a guest speaker to discuss the importance of youth leadership in an increasingly divided America. His presence alone had stirred the media. Some viewed him as the next torchbearer of the Trump legacy, while others dismissed him as just another privileged political child. As Barron took the stage, the room grew quiet. His deep voice resonated through the hall as he began speaking about unity, hard work, and the power of young people in shaping the future. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, not seeking the spotlight but commanding respect nonetheless. Then, in the middle of his speech, a voice cut through the silence. A well-known liberal journalist, seated in the front row, scoffed loudly and muttered just loud enough for the microphones to pick up. What does this kid know about real struggles? His biggest challenge is deciding between caviar or lobster for dinner. A ripple of awkward laughter spread through the crowd. Some chuckled nervously, others shifted in their seats. The cameras zoomed in on Barron, anticipating his reaction. Would he lash out? Would he ignore it? Would he walk away? But what happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. Barron Trump paused mid-sentence. The slight smirk on the journalist's face suggested he expected a reaction, anger, embarrassment, or perhaps a flustered attempt to defend himself. But Barron didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, he took a deep breath and slowly turned his gaze toward the man. The audience held its breath, waiting. A few seconds passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every subtle expression on Barron's face. Yet, he remained composed, his blue eyes steady and unwavering. Then, with an air of calm authority that seemed well beyond his years, Barron finally spoke. "You know," he began, his voice measured and deliberate, "I could take the easy route and respond with an insult. I could remind you that mocking someone based on their family or background isn't exactly a sign of journalistic integrity. But that wouldn't accomplish anything, would it?" His words hung in the air, their impact immediate. A few in the audience nodded. Even those who didn't support his family's politics had to admit, this young man had poise. Barron continued, "You don't know me. You've never had a conversation with me. And yet, you assume that my life has been nothing but luxury, that I've never faced real challenges. Let me ask you something. Is a person's struggle only valid if it matches your definition of hardship?" The journalist's smirk faltered slightly. Barron pressed on. "Hardship comes in many forms. Yes, I've never had to worry about where my next meal is coming from. But I have lived under constant scrutiny from the moment I could walk. I've had people mock my height, my family, my every move, all before I was old enough to vote. I've seen my parents vilified, my childhood dissected by strangers, and my privacy disregarded as if I weren't a real person with real emotions." The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. "I don't expect sympathy," Barron added, "but I do expect fairness. Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be about?" The journalist shifted in his seat, suddenly looking a little less amused. A murmur spread through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged glances, surprised by Barron's maturity. Even those who had initially laughed at the journalist's comment now seemed uncomfortable. The journalist, however, wasn't ready to back down just yet. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, speaking louder this time so that everyone could hear. "Well, Barron," he said with a forced smile, "that was quite a speech. But let's be real here. There's a difference between being scrutinized for being a public figure and facing real adversity. You were born into wealth and power. Millions of kids out there don't have the privilege of growing up in a penthouse. They don't have Secret Service protection. They don't get to attend elite schools. So forgive me if I find it hard to sympathize with your struggles. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but the tension remained thick. The journalist leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if he had just won the debate. Barron, however, didn't flinch. If anything, his posture became even more composed. He tilted his head slightly, considering his next words carefully. "I appreciate your perspective," he said finally, "and I don't blame you for feeling that way, but let me ask you something. Since when does privilege erase a person's right to be treated with basic decency?" The journalist blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I understand that I was born into circumstances that most people can only dream of. But I didn't choose my last name. I didn't ask for the attention, the expectations, or the criticism. And I certainly didn't ask to be mocked in a public forum simply because of who my parents are." The room remained silent. Barron's voice didn't waver. "Here's the thing. It's easy to look at someone from the outside and assume you know their entire story. But real journalism, the kind that actually makes a difference, seeks to understand before it judges." For the first time, the journalist's expression softened. He opened his mouth as if to say something but hesitated. Barron continued, "If you want to have a real conversation about privilege and adversity, I'm happy to do that. But if you're just here to score cheap points by making me a punchline, then I think we both know that says more about you than it does about me." A few people in the audience started clapping. It was hesitant at first, then grew louder. Within seconds, the entire hall was applauding. The journalist glanced around, clearly surprised by the reaction. He shifted in his seat, suddenly looking less sure of himself. Barron simply stood there, his expression calm but firm. He had said what he needed to say, and he had done it without raising his voice, without throwing insults, without losing his composure. The applause continued, and for the first time that afternoon, the journalist had nothing to say. As the applause grew louder, Barron Trump remained standing at the podium, his expression unreadable. He hadn't sought to humiliate the journalist or win over the crowd with theatrics. He had simply spoken the truth as he saw it. Meanwhile, the journalist shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The smirk he had worn moments ago had vanished. Instead, he seemed to realize that he had underestimated the young man standing before him. One by one, people in the audience stood up. A woman in her late 40s, wearing a press badge from an independent news outlet, raised her hand. "Barron," she said, her voice carrying over the claps. "Whether people agree with your family's politics or not, I think most would admit you've handled yourself with remarkable composure today. But I have to ask, how do you deal with the weight of expectations placed on you?" Barron took a moment before responding. "Honestly, I try not to think about it too much. If I worried about what people expected me to be, I'd never have the freedom to be who I actually am." The woman nodded thoughtfully. Another voice chimed in. This time, it was a college student wearing a t-shirt with a progressive slogan. "Do you ever feel like you have to defend your family all the time, even when you disagree with them?" Barron gave a small smile. "No one agrees with their family on everything. But here's the thing. I don't think my job is to be my father's spokesperson. He has plenty of people for that. My job is to figure out who I am as an individual, apart from the politics, apart from the noise." This response drew another wave of murmurs, this time, more of curiosity than criticism. Even those who had come in expecting to see just another Trump found themselves listening. As the questions continued, the journalist who had mocked Barron earlier remained silent. His arms were still crossed, but his expression had changed. He was watching Barron closely, perhaps realizing that this privileged kid was far more thoughtful and articulate than he had assumed. Finally, after several more exchanges, Barron glanced back at the journalist and addressed him directly. "I want to leave you with one last thought." The room quieted again. "You talked about real adversity earlier," Barron said. "And you're right. There are people in this world who have faced struggles far worse than I ever will. But isn't it possible that everyone, no matter their background, has their own challenges? Isn't it possible that privilege doesn't automatically make someone immune to hardship? And most importantly, shouldn't we be encouraging young people to rise above the negativity, rather than dragging them down with it? For the first time, the journalist had no quick comeback. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging, perhaps begrudgingly, that the young man standing before him had just changed the conversation entirely. The weight of Barron's words lingered in the air. The audience, initially prepared for a moment of mockery or controversy, had instead witnessed something unexpected: poise, wisdom, and a calm that was rare for someone his age. The journalist, who had started this exchange with a snide remark, was now visibly processing what had just happened. He had been expecting a privileged kid to stumble, to get defensive, to lash out in a way that would validate his preconceived notions. But instead, Barron had turned the tables, not with anger, but with logic, humility, and self-awareness. A slow but steady realization dawned on many in the audience. Perhaps they had misjudged him. Another reporter, a middle-aged man from a major network, leaned forward in his chair. "Barron," he said, "do you ever feel like the world has already decided who you are before you even have a chance to prove yourself?" Barron let out a quiet chuckle, nodding. "All the time," he admitted. "People see my last name, and they assume they know everything about me. What I think, how I live, what my future will be. But here's what I've learned. The only way to change someone's mind is not by arguing with them, but by showing them who you really are." A few heads in the audience nodded in agreement. Even those who didn't necessarily support his family were beginning to respect his maturity. The journalist who had mocked him finally spoke up again. His voice was softer this time, less confrontational. "So, if that's the case, what do you want people to know about you? Beyond the Trump name?" Barron's expression grew thoughtful. "I want people to know that I'm my own person," he said simply. "I don't define myself by what my last name means to others. I define myself by my actions, by how I treat people, and by the choices I make. And whether someone agrees with my family's politics or not, I hope they can at least respect that." A hushed silence filled the room. It wasn't the silence of discomfort this time, but one of reflection. Then, without warning, someone in the back of the room began clapping. It was a young man, likely a college student, someone who had probably walked in with his own preconceived notions. But he was clapping, and soon others joined in. The journalist glanced around, realizing that the momentum in the room had shifted. What had started as a moment of mockery had turned into something much bigger, a conversation about fairness, judgment, and the way we treat one another. Barron had done something remarkable. He had taken an attack and turned it into an opportunity for dialogue. And in doing so, he had left everyone, including his critics, silent with admiration. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the room remained charged with an undeniable shift. People weren't just seeing Barron Trump as the son of a former president anymore. They were seeing him as an individual, someone who had the ability to think critically and respond with maturity beyond his years. The journalist, now clearly aware that he had miscalculated the situation, leaned forward in his chair. His demeanor had changed, less arrogant, more reflective. "I have to admit," he said, adjusting his tie, "I didn't expect this conversation to go this way. I assumed you'd either dodge the question or lash out. But you didn't." Barron offered a polite smile. "I don't believe in dodging challenges. And as for lashing out, what would that accomplish? It would just prove the worst assumptions people already have about me." The journalist sighed, rubbing his chin. "You're right about something," he admitted. "We in the media often rush to paint people in a certain way without really taking the time to understand them. And, full disclosure, I probably walked in here with a bias about you." Some in the audience raised their eyebrows, surprised at the journalist's candid admission. Barron didn't gloat or seize the moment for a victory lap. Instead, he simply nodded. "I respect that you're willing to admit it," he said. "It's easy to make assumptions about people, especially in politics. But if we keep seeing each other as caricatures instead of human beings, nothing ever changes." The journalist let out a small chuckle. "Well, that's something I didn't expect to hear from a Trump." Barron grinned slightly. "Maybe that's the problem," he said. People expect too much from a name, and not enough from the individual behind it. A ripple of murmured agreement moved through the audience. It was a rare sight, an exchange between a media personality and a political figure's family member that wasn't a shouting match, but an actual conversation. Sensing that the moment had turned into something more profound than the usual political spectacle, the event's moderator, a respected journalist from a major news network, stepped forward. "This has been an enlightening discussion," she said. "And Barron, I have to say, you've handled yourself with remarkable composure. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you one last question." Barron turned to her, his expression open and ready. "If you had one message for people, especially young people, who feel like they're constantly being judged by forces outside their control, what would it be?" Barron thought for a moment, then spoke with the same calm assurance he had displayed throughout the event. "I'd tell them that people will always have opinions about you, and most of the time, those opinions will be based on incomplete information," he said. "You can either let that define you or you can choose to define yourself. And the best way to do that is by proving, through your actions, that you are more than the labels people place on you." A beat of silence. Then, once again, applause filled the hall. But this time, it wasn't polite or hesitant. It was full, genuine, and lasting. Even the journalist who had started it all couldn't help but join in. As the applause filled the hall, Barron Trump remained composed, offering a small, appreciative nod. He wasn't someone who craved the spotlight, but he had undeniably earned the respect of those in the room. Even his critics had to admit that he had handled the situation with grace and intelligence. The journalist, who had initially mocked him, stood up. His posture was different now, no longer leaning back in smug confidence, but upright, as if he had gained a new perspective. As the claps died down, he cleared his throat and extended his hand toward Barron. "I think I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I came here expecting something else, someone else. I judged you before I even heard you speak. That wasn't fair." A few gasps rippled through the audience. It wasn't often that a journalist openly admitted a mistake, especially in such a public setting. Barron didn't hesitate. He reached out and shook the man's hand firmly. "I respect that," he said, his voice genuine. "We all make assumptions. The important thing is being willing to reconsider them." The audience, still absorbing what had just happened, broke into another round of applause. This time not just for Barron, but for the rare display of humility and mutual respect in a time when conversations often turned into battles. After the event officially concluded, Barron was swarmed by journalists, students, and even political figures who had attended out of curiosity. Some wanted to ask more questions, others simply wanted to shake his hand. Even those who didn't agree with his family's politics found themselves intrigued by the young man who had just defied expectations. The journalist, still standing nearby, watched the scene unfold. He had spent years covering politics, interviewing high-profile figures, and engaging in heated debates, but something about this encounter had shifted his perspective. A fellow journalist nudged him. "Didn't see that coming, did you?" she asked with a smirk. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not in a million years." He glanced back at Barron, who was now speaking to a group of young people with the same calm demeanor he had shown on stage. "You know," the journalist mused, "for someone who never sought the spotlight, I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot more of him in the future." His colleague nodded in agreement. And this time, people might actually listen. As Barron continued to interact with the crowd, the atmosphere in the room had noticeably changed. What had started as a moment of public humiliation had turned into something far more meaningful, a conversation about perception, judgment, and the power of individual character. Reporters who had once come with pre-written narratives were now scribbling furiously in their notepads, adjusting their angles, rewriting their headlines. The young man they had expected to be a passive political figure had turned out to be something much more complex, thoughtful, articulate, and unwilling to be defined by the assumptions of others. A group of college students approached Barron, eager to speak with him. One of them, a young woman wearing a press badge for a student newspaper, held out her recorder. "Barron, after today, do you think moments like this will change the way people perceive you?" Barron smiled slightly, considering his answer. I hope so, he said. But I also know that perception isn't something you can control overnight. Some people will always see me a certain way, no matter what I say or do. But that's not what matters. What matters is being consistent in your values and showing people who you are through action, not just words. The students nodded, impressed by his response. Another student, a young man wearing a shirt with a progressive slogan, hesitated before stepping forward. I'll be honest, he admitted. I didn't expect to agree with anything you said today, but you made me think, and I respect that. Barron extended his hand, and the young man shook it firmly. That means a lot, Barron said sincerely. If we can get to a place where we're actually listening to each other instead of just assuming the worst, then I think we're already making progress. Meanwhile, the journalist who had mocked Barron earlier stood off to the side, watching everything unfold. He had spent years covering political figures, scrutinizing their every move, but this was different. He had been prepared to expose an entitled, inexperienced young man. Instead, he had met someone who had just taught him a lesson in humility. Turning to his colleague, he sighed. I think I owe my viewers a different take than what I originally planned. His colleague smirked. Better get to rewriting, then. The journalist chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, looks like I underestimated him. By the time Barron Trump left the event, social media was already buzzing. Clips of his exchange with the journalist had gone viral, spreading across platforms like wildfire. The headlines were unexpected. Barron Trump stuns journalist with poise and logic. Not just a Trump, Barron steps out of his father's shadow. Barron Trump's response to a liberal journalist silences critics. People from both sides of the political spectrum found themselves discussing the moment. Some praised his maturity, while others grudgingly admitted that they had underestimated him. Even those who had little interest in politics found themselves intrigued by the way he had handled the situation. The journalist who had mocked Barron found himself facing unexpected criticism. Not from conservatives, but from members of his own media circles. Some accused him of trying to score cheap political points at the expense of an 18-year-old. Others questioned whether the media's obsession with the Trump family had gone too far. That night, as he prepared for his network's evening broadcast, the journalist knew he had a choice to make. He could spin the story, frame it in a way that minimized Barron's response and stuck to the usual partisan talking points. Or he could tell the truth. When the cameras went live, he took a deep breath. Tonight, I want to talk about something unexpected, he began. As many of you know, I attended a leadership event earlier today, where I had the opportunity to hear Barron Trump speak. I'll be honest, I went in with assumptions. I thought I knew what kind of person he would be. I was wrong. He paused, the weight of his words settling in. Regardless of how you feel about his family, Barron Trump showed something today that deserves recognition. Grace under pressure, wisdom beyond his years, and an ability to rise above personal attacks. He reminded me, and hopefully all of us, that we shouldn't be so quick to judge someone before we truly hear them out. The broadcast clip quickly went viral. Some viewers were shocked to see a mainstream journalist admitting fault so openly. Others appreciated the rare moment of humility in the media. As for Barron, he remained quiet on social media. He wasn't interested in capitalizing on the moment or turning it into a political weapon. Instead, he carried on as he always had, focused on being his own person, regardless of what the world expected of him. But whether he wanted it or not, the world had started to see him differently. The following morning, Barron Trump woke up to find his name trending across multiple platforms. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Some from friends, some from political figures, and even a few from people he had never met, but who had been moved by his words. But unlike many others who had gone viral before, Barron didn't rush to capitalize on the attention. He didn't schedule TV interviews or issue a follow-up statement. Instead, he went about his day as usual, attending a private meeting with a youth leadership organization he had been quietly supporting for months. While the media continued to debate the significance of the moment, Barron himself remained unfazed. He had never sought to be a political figure or a symbol of anything, He had simply defended himself with logic and dignity when faced with an unfair attack. Yet, in doing so, he had sparked a national conversation. For the next few days, major news outlets ran segments analyzing the event. Some praised Barron for his composure, while others struggled to fit him into their usual narratives. Was he a future politician? A symbol of a new generation of conservatives? Or simply a young man who had refused to be defined by his last name? The journalist who had mocked him, now faced with both criticism and newfound respect, issued a full op-ed in a major publication. The title read, "I mocked Barron Trump, and he taught me a lesson in grace." In it, he admitted his mistake, reflecting on how easy it was to judge people without truly knowing them. His words resonated with many, sparking discussions about media bias, personal responsibility, and the need for more respectful discourse in public life. Meanwhile, Barron continued to avoid the spotlight. He had no interest in turning the moment into a political weapon. But whether he liked it or not, the world had taken notice. A few months later, as he prepared to begin his college journey, a reporter managed to catch him for a brief comment outside an event. "Barron, after everything that happened, do you see yourself getting into politics?" the reporter asked. Barron smiled, shaking his head. "I think people are too obsessed with labels," he replied. "Right now, I just want to focus on growing, learning, and becoming the best version of myself. The rest, that'll work itself out in time." With that, he walked away, his head high, his name no longer just a legacy, but a story of his own.